Donald Trump just walked into a New York courtroom and the entire myth collapsed in real time. A devastating recording reportedly played, and suddenly the great dealmaker is on tape talking about stretching the truth on property values. And then he melts down and attacks the judge like it's a political rally. This isn't spin. This is power meeting proof and chaos spilling out the second the truth hits the room. You can feel the panic, the cover-up energy, the desperation, because if there's one tape, what else exists? And who's about to drop it next?
My message is simple. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you think you may have, no one is above the law. And it is my responsibility and my duty and my job to enforce it. The law is both powerful and fragile. And today in court, we will prove our case. I thank you all for being here. And again, justice will prevail. Thank you.
Again, that was Attorney General Letitia James speaking very briefly before today's civil trial against...
What's being described here isn't just another loud Trump moment. It's a stress test for a country that claims it's built on equal justice. Because when a powerful figure is confronted with evidence, especially recorded evidence, and the response is to attack the judge, smear the court, and turn the proceeding into a political rally, that's not fighting back. That's pressure. That's intimidation. And it's the kind of behavior that democracies learn to fear, because it teaches people that the law is only legitimate when it flatters the powerful. Let's slow it down and put it in plain English. According to the reporting in this segment, prosecutors played audio recordings in a New York civil fraud case that captured Trump in his own voice, discussing stretching the truth about property valuations to secure better terms from lenders. And the claim is that after those recordings were played, Trump erupted, launching a personal attack on the judge instead of responding like a normal litigant in a court of law. If you're not a lawyer, you still understand why recordings hit differently. People can argue about paperwork. They can argue about numbers, assumptions, accountants, consultants. Everyone does it. That's just real estate. But when it's your voice on tape describing the mindset, when the language sounds like you knew you were shading reality to get a financial advantage, that's when defenses shrink fast. That's when the story stops being about technicalities and becomes about intent. And intent is the whole ballgame in fraud.
Now to the US, Donald Trump has clashed with the judge at his civil fraud trial in New York on Monday. The former president is accused of inflating the value of his properties in order to secure favourable loans. The judge told him to stop treating his court appearance like a political rally. It's just one of several legal battles Mr. Trump is currently facing. Here's our North America editor, Sarah Smith.
I think it went very well.
After a chaotic day in court, Donald Trump headed straight for the cameras, insisting he's being hounded for purely political reasons.
Everything we did was absolutely right. To think that we're being sued and spending all this time and money, and yet people being killed all over the world, that this country could stop.
Here's why the who cares reaction is wrong. Banks and insurance companies don't price deals on vibes. They price them on risk. They use valuations to determine terms, rates, collateral, and exposure. When someone inflates valuations to get better loan terms, that's not an abstract, victimless paper crime. It changes who gets access to money, at what cost, and with what protections. It shifts risk onto institutions that then price that risk into the economy. And yes, regular people end up paying for systemic dishonesty one way or another, through tighter lending, higher costs, and a broader culture that rewards cheating. And let's be honest about something else, the cultural double standard. Millions of Americans have had their lives wrecked over far smaller allegations of misrepresentation. People lose jobs, clearances, licenses, opportunities. They get denied mortgages. They get audited into oblivion. They get told rules are rules. They don't get to scream at the decision maker, call the process rigged, and then walk out to cameras claiming they're the victim of a political conspiracy. That option is reserved for a tiny class of people who've learned that if they're loud enough, institutions sometimes flinch. That's why this story matters beyond Trump. It's about whether we are actually serious when we say no one is above the law, especially the people with the most power, money, and attention. Because that phrase doesn't mean anything if it only applies to the powerless. If accountability is something we preach downward but never enforce upward, then it isn't accountability, it's hierarchy. Now, the segment also frames this as a penalty phase after liability has already been established earlier in the case. That matters because it changes what the fight is about. At this stage, if the court has already determined fraudulent conduct occurred, the dispute becomes, how severe are the consequences? How do you deter this behavior? How do you ensure it doesn't repeat? And how do you respond when the defendant treats the court like a stage? And if the reporting is accurate, that prosecutors introduced recordings late in closing, it makes sense strategically. Closing is about leaving the judge with a clear, coherent story that matches the evidence. A recording that suggests direct involvement and awareness does exactly that. It reduces wiggle room. It undermines the claim of, I delegated everything. It makes it harder to hide behind layers of professionals. Because that I relied on accountants defense is one of the oldest tricks in white-collar litigation. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes executives really are removed. But when you're talking about someone who publicly, obsessively brands his net worth, someone whose identity has been built around wealth and deal-making, there's an obvious credibility gap. The image being sold is, I'm the mastermind. The legal defense becomes, I wasn't involved. Those two things can't both be fully true. And that's why a recording is so damaging. It doesn't just add evidence, it reframes the narrative. It says, you can't tell the court you are hands off and tell the public you're the greatest deal maker alive. Pick one. Now let's talk about the reaction, the attack on the judge. This is where the pro-democracy alarm bells should be loud, regardless of your party. Courts are one of the last places in American life where the rules are supposed to apply, even when the crowd doesn't like them. You can dislike a judge's reasoning. You can appeal. You can argue. You can file motions. That's all legitimate. But when a litigant, especially a president, tries to delegitimize the judge personally, to paint the court as corrupt, simply because the court won't give him what he wants, that is not normal legal advocacy. That is a political intimidation tactic. It's, if you don't rule my way, you're illegitimate. And that idea is poison. Because once that becomes normal, courts stop being courts. They become arenas where the loudest political faction decides what the law is. And that's not rule of law. That's rule by pressure. The segment mentions the judge being called a corrupt puppet and notes that this was framed as factually wrong in terms of party affiliation. But the bigger point isn't the registration detail. The bigger point is the strategy. Reduce complex legal findings to a tribal label, then tell your supporters the process is fraudulent by definition. It's the same move we've seen aimed at election administrators, juries, prosecutors, and even career civil servants. Attack the legitimacy of any institution that constrains you. That's how you build a politics of impunity. You don't have to prove you're right. You just have to convince your base that no one has the authority to say you're wrong. And when you do it from the presidency, or while seeking the presidency, you add something even more dangerous. You suggest that the state itself should be used as retaliation, that judges should fear what happens to them if they don't comply, that prosecutors should fear defunding, firing, investigation, public vilification. That's how independence collapses. Not in one dramatic coup, but in 1,000 small acts of intimidation that make public servants decide it's safer to look away. This is why gag orders exist in high-profile cases and why courts sometimes impose boundaries. It's not about silencing political opinions. It's about preventing intimidation of court staff and witnesses and preserving the integrity of proceedings. If you turn a legal case into a personal harassment campaign, you distort justice. You alter behavior around the case. You create fear. and fear is not a legal argument. If this story is being framed as a clash, I want to be careful with the language. Clash can make it sound like two equal sides yelling across a table. That's not what court is. A courtroom isn't a debate stage. It isn't cable news. It isn't a rally. It's a place with rules, because those rules are how we protect the legitimacy of outcomes. A judge has authority in that room, period. So when a defendant decides the rules don't apply to them, that's not passion. That's contempt for the institution. And contempt from the top is contagious. People take cues from leaders. If you teach millions of Americans that judges are enemies when judges don't bend, you're not just undermining one case. You're undermining the idea that disputes should be resolved through law rather than force, threats, or mob pressure. Now, the segment also raises the issue of sworn testimony and the possibility of perjury if the recordings contradict what was said under oath. Let's be precise. Perjury is serious, and whether it applies depends on what was testified to, what the recording actually captures, and how directly it contradicts material statements. I'm not going to pretend we have the full evidentiary record in a YouTube transcript, but the principle stands. If you build a defense around "I didn't know, I wasn't involved," and then you're captured on tape discussing the very thing you claim you didn't know about, that's not a small inconsistency. That's a credibility collapse. It matters legally, and it matters culturally, because credibility is the currency of leadership. And that's the part so many people miss. Trump's political brand isn't just a set of policies, it's a persona. The strongman dealmaker, the man who's always in control, always outsmarting everyone, always winning. When evidence undermines that persona, the response isn't quiet correction, it's rage. Rage is the cover. Rage is the substitute for explanation. And the reason rage works politically is because it shifts the conversation away from the evidence and toward the emotion. Suddenly the question isn't, did he do it? The question becomes, do you like him, or do you hate the people who are after him? That's how accountability gets derailed. You're not asked to weigh facts. You're asked to pick a tribe. That is exactly how democracies get weaker. And we should be clear. There is nothing pro-freedom about demanding exemption from rules. Real freedom is knowing the system doesn't change its standards based on your bank account or your fame. Real freedom is knowing you can walk into court and the judge has to apply the law, not the crowd's mood. Real freedom is having institutions sturdy enough to withstand pressure from the most powerful person in the country. Now, what does this mean for ordinary Americans? It means that when you see a leader try to bulldoze the judiciary, you should recognize the pattern, because it's never just about one case. It's about the precedent. If a president can publicly demean the legitimacy of courts and face no consequence, if it becomes just normal politics, then the next step is deciding which court rulings get ignored, which orders get delayed, which subpoenas get brushed off, which judges get targeted. At that point, law becomes optional. And when law is optional for the powerful, it becomes harsher for everyone else. That's how it always works. Systems that stop restraining the top compensate by squeezing the bottom. The powerful get discretion. The rest get rigidity. That's not a guess. That's history. Now, the segment also mixes in broader political threads, impeachment talk, other investigations, other controversies. I'm going to keep the focus on what's strongest and most grounded in what's being described. A legal case, evidence in the form of audio, and a public attack on the judge in response. Even if you strip everything else away, that is enough to matter. Because the core question is simple. When evidence emerges that undermines a powerful man's narrative, does he submit to the process like everyone else, or does he try to break the process? And if he tries to break it, do institutions hold? That's why the optics matter too. A courtroom outburst from a president isn't just bad manners. It's a signal to supporters. The judge is the enemy. It's a signal to officials. If you cross me, I'll unleash my audience. And it's a signal to the country. My power is bigger than your institutions. Democracy can't survive if that signal becomes normalized. Now, let me address a common response I hear. But the system is political. Everyone's political. Sure, people have beliefs. Prosecutors are elected sometimes. Judges are appointed. Nothing is in a vacuum. But that's why we have procedures. That's why we have evidence standards. That's why we have appeals. That's why we have written rulings. The system is designed to channel human bias through constraints. The answer to imperfect institutions is not to destroy institutions. It's to strengthen them. It's to demand transparency. It's to insist on evidence. It's to hold everyone to standards, including the people we like. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because authoritarian movements always start by claiming they're the victims of corruption. That's the entry point. The courts are rigged. The media is lying. The bureaucrats are deep state. And then, once enough people accept that narrative, they'll accept anything done in the name of fighting back, even if it means dismantling checks and balances. That's how you get leaders who can't be investigated, can't be prosecuted, can't be constrained. That's how you get impunity. Now, what should you watch next in this story if the reporting is accurate and this is where things stand? Watch the judge's response to misconduct and any violations of court orders. Judges typically have discretion. They can sanction behavior, they can set boundaries, and they can consider conduct when evaluating credibility and penalties. If a litigant tries to bully the court has tools. Watch how conservative media and MAGA influencers frame the recordings. If the audio is as described, you're going to see a familiar playbook. Deny, dismiss, distract. It's out of context. It's AI. It's a setup. Or they'll pivot to unrelated topics to avoid sitting with the evidence. And watch how elected Republicans respond. Not the loudest ones, the ones who always do the performance, but the ones who want to look like institutionalists. Do they defend the legitimacy of courts even when it's politically inconvenient? Or do they join the attack because it's safer to please Trump than to respect the judiciary? That's the real measure of whether a party is committed to democracy as a system, not just democracy as a slogan. Because here's the hard truth. Democracy isn't tested when your side is winning. It's tested when your side is being constrained. It's tested when your leader is in trouble. It's tested when evidence is ugly and you're tempted to excuse it to protect your tribe. That's when you find out who believes in the rule of law. And I want to end where we began, with the principle. No one is above the law is not a line for press conferences. It's the foundation of legitimacy. Without it, every election becomes a fight over who gets to punish whom, because there's no neutral system to resolve disputes. Without it, the presidency becomes a crown. If Trump's response to recorded evidence is to attack the judge, that tells you something vital about how he understands power, not as a public trust, but as personal dominance, not as accountability, but as exemption, not as service, but as entitlement. A free country can survive a politician who's loud. It cannot survive a political culture that accepts intimidation as normal. It cannot survive a president who treats the judiciary like an enemy to be crushed. This isn't about loving prosecutors. It isn't about pretending courts are perfect. It's about refusing the idea that the highest office comes with a license to bully the system until the system breaks. Because once the system breaks, it won't break in a way that protects you. It'll break in a way that protects the powerful. And that, more than any headline phrase, is what's at stake here.